Good morning. Hi, I'm Mark LaRochelle, and you are in the How to Understand the Basics of APIs. And in this particular presentation, we are going to start really at the very beginning. So this is perfect for people who know of the word API, but really doesn't know what the meaning is behind all that. So if you're one of those people, this may be perfect for you to get started. And it sort of sets the stage for a lot of the integration track you're going to see here at DevCon. There's a lot of follow-up behind this, so as you move through that integration track, you'll see that this is sort of the foundation, and then you can move along as you get going there. All right. So who am I? I started the productive computing. Let me just get this angled correctly here. There we go. I started a company called Productive Computing way back in 1996, and I'm currently wear these sets of hats, quite a bit to do there. We are located in Southern California, and at the moment, I'm the lead architect of our 18 plugins, and we also have solutions for CRM. I'm also the senior engineer for our hosting division, so we have a full-fledged hosting service for productive computing for our customers. We also, incidentally, have a vertical market business as well. We support people who tow boats all around the coasts of America. People who tow boats come in, and it's a vertical market solution that uses FileMaker and FileMaker Go. So that's something else we do. And then in the last year or so, we've created something called Productive Computing University, which we're excited about. Some of the things you're learning here are actually covered in the university in the form of courses. So we teach everything about not FileMaker, not how to program FileMaker, but all the ancillary things like how to install SSLs, APIs, and FileMaker certification. In addition, I'm certified 7 through 18, and I'm also AWS, Amazon Web Services, certified since 2016. Okay. On the side, I also am a part-time musician, and I have a YouTube channel where I teach people how to program their electronic keyboards, their actual music keyboards. So I take some of that computer knowledge and some of that music knowledge, bring it together, and have a music channel for people who want to learn how to operate their Nord keyboards. All right, so today we are talking about APIs. And you might ask yourself, what is an API? And even after I define it by telling you that it's an application programming interface, that may still not mean much to you. But if you think of these three things here as what an API is, it's really just one piece of software talking to another, or one system talking to another system. That's really all it is. It's that in its simplest form. It's also a structured request with a structured response. So it's just not random talking, it's structured. So the package that you create to make the request is constructed in a certain way, and the other end of that is listening, and that's also structured. So the idea, really, this all boils down to a request. You make a request of an API, and then it returns a response. That is really what this whole thing is all about, a request and a response. Now, I have some exciting things to tell you about because towards the end of my presentation, I've been given permission to show you a few slides about what you might see tomorrow. I don't have a demo or anything like that, but I do have some slides explaining a little bit about what FileMaker is, what's coming in the future. So an API can be considered like a contract where there's an understanding between both parties, and there's an agreed upon standard set by which those parties communicate. Oops. Okay, so here it is in its simplest form. I'll take an analogy where you have a consumer, a person, coming into, let's say, a restaurant, and you have a menu of items that you can order. So consider yourself the customer, and this is known as the application or client making the request. You make the request to a person who, let's say, is a waiter or a server, and that person is the API in this scenario. That API then brings that request to the kitchen or the server. That's where the request is processed. In the case of a kitchen, they're making your food. Then, once the food is complete, it goes back through the API or the waiter, and then you receive your completed food. So that's, in its simplest form, what it is. This thing is having a mind of its own here for a second. All right, let me just go back one slide. So, believe it or not, if you've worked with the FileMaker web viewer, which has been around for a long time, if you've gone to layout mode, and you've created a web viewer, and you see the different things you can do with the web viewer. There's some predefined URLs in there. And one of the predefined URLs is actually your ability to talk to FedEx, where you can construct a URL and simply give it a packing number. Well, believe it or not, that is talking to an API. You're talking to the FedEx API, where you give it a simple packing number, or a shipment number, or any number of things that FedEx can allow you to do. And with that, it constructs a URL. So the URL might look something like this. Inside that web viewer, you're simply putting an address and tracking numbers, XYZ. And FileMaker interprets that as an actual URL that looks like that and returns to you the response. And the response in this case is your scheduled delivery is on this date, or it's wherever it is in the process of that. So that really is talking to an API. So many of you have already done this, I'm sure, if you played with the web viewer. So in a sense, you've already have some rudimentary experience with that. So before we can go too much further, we have to understand that there's two sides to this equation. There's the idea of an API consumer, and that can come in the form of a mobile phone, or let's say a website, or even FileMaker Pro Advanced. So FileMaker Pro Advanced, as you know it today, has the ability to consume information through an API. You can create your own request, reach out to an API, and get information back. That's the consumer portion of it. Then you have the provider portion of it. The provider is the thing on the other end. In this case, like you saw earlier, FedEx. Google is also a provider. And then you have FileMaker itself is also a provider of API information, such as the data API. So with the data API, you can take a FileMaker file, put it on FileMaker server, open it up, build in the security, and now that file becomes a repository of information that any other API on the outside of that can talk to. In addition to FileMaker files being an API source, again, that's the data API, then you have the admin API, which is FileMaker Server. The engine also has a separate API engine, completely built in, and that allows you to control and manipulate FileMaker Server. And we'll be talking a little bit about that in the coming slides here. So the important thing to take away from this slide is that when you talk about FileMaker, the platform, it really is both sides of the equation. It's both a consumer of APIs as well as a provider. So now, you may be familiar with a lot of these entities that I'm about to show you here, but it's important to note that each one of these has API capability. So on the social media front, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of those have an API that you could talk to. You could post information, gather information. On the database and CRM world, you have Salesforce and Fusionsoft. All of these entities have APIs that you can talk to today under different conditions and in different environments. In the shopping cart world, there's a lot of different web shopping carts, but a lot of them are really great at taking orders. Not a lot of them are good at managing customers or inventory or anything like that. So it's essential that a shopping cart has an API that we as developers can talk to, pull information down, or push products up. Then on the business side, something as simple as Dropbox, if you wanted to just move files to Dropbox programmatically, you could do that as well. And you can see the others I've listed there. Now, before we can really talk about API, where this all starts getting a little fuzzy for a lot of people, and for me included when I first started, is the whole notion of the security. security is such a big part of today's world and everything that we do, that APIs really do need world-class security in order to talk to them. And you'll find that during your journey, as you learn how to do and work with APIs, the security is always one of the big sticking points, one of the most difficult to get around and really understand. So let's take a minute or two and talk about security as it relates to APIs. And there's 4 that I'd like to talk about. But before we talk about the different types of security, we just have to define 2 terms here. The first term is authentication. We've heard the word, we sort of know what it is, but let me just define it a little clearer. Authentication is the idea of we're going to identify who you are. Do you have an account? Do you have the privileges to gain access to this information? That can come in the form of a username and password or an API key, which we'll talk about. That's authentication. Not to be confused with authorization, which is what happens after you get approval to be into a system. This tells you what you can do once you're in. So taken from a page out of FileMaker, we're already familiar with these type of scenarios. We've all seen this dialog box before. This is authentication against an account that we might have in FileMaker. It's asking us a few things. It's asking us, what is your username? Do I agree that there's a username in there for you? What is your password? Does it match? And is the account active? If all of those things are true, then you are authenticated to gain access to that file. But just because you gain access to the file doesn't mean you have run of the house. It really does mean what authorization privileges do you have, and that's dictated by the traditional privilege set dialog that you see here. What layouts do you have access to, and so forth, what records. Okay. So if we go back to our kitchen analogy, where we had the consumer and on the left side, the waiter and the bar, what if in that same restaurant, you decided to ask a simple question? I'd like an adult beverage. And if you don't look old enough, which some of us don't have this problem of looking old enough, but if you look young enough to be asked, you'll be asked for, there's really a roadblock there because you've asked for something that you might not have access to. So your first situation is you're being authenticated. How are you being authenticated? You're typically asked for an ID. And the ID says, is this person who they say they are? Do they look like the picture on the ID? And what is their age? That's the authentication part of it. The authorization is what can you do now that I know you're, let's say 21 here in the US, you're authorized to then have the privilege of ordering any adult beverage that we have for you. So that's bringing those ideas. So APIs work a lot like this. Now there's 4 basic methods of security that I just want to briefly cover. This is sort of the hardest part where you have to put your brain on the most. You have no authentication. In fact, you saw when I did the FedEx example, no one asked me for a username and password. It simply let me put in a shipping number and it gave me a response, so there's none. Then there's HTTP basic. Then there's the idea of API keys. And then finally, OAuth, which is the modern way of doing security, and most of the APIs are moving in that direction if they're not already there. So I'll break each one of these down in a little bit more detail for you. So none. This is perhaps the easiest to understand. There's no passwords, there's no keys, there's no tokens. It's simply open, and it's also known as an open API. Examples of this would be the FedEx one that I used earlier. Google Maps is another great example. It's not asking you for your username and password to put in a simple zip code, for example, or if I want to get the weather for a certain place, I can just simply put in the zip code and we'll get the weather. Now, the next form of security is called HTTP basic. And this is sort of how it all started when they started asking for some basic security. This truly has the name that fits the bill. HTTP basic is actually a perfect name for this because that's really what it is. And in most cases, HTTP basic is simply asking for a username and password. And this is still used today under certain circumstances. And you'll also note that in most cases, if you're not behind an SSL certificate or things like that, you might encode the username and password, but it might not be encrypted. So encoded just means it's interpreted differently, but encrypted means it's actually secure. So that would be HTTP basic, and examples of that would be, well, GitHub, that is a repository for software developers, so you can have a basic account there. Testing with Slack. Slack is a communications tool, so if you're just testing with Slack, they just have basic HTTP communication. And then older APIs, like when APIs first came out, username and password was pretty much all you needed. And I put on here private networks, because you might have your homegrown enterprise API created in-house, and because you're in an enterprise protected behind a layer of security, in other words, none of the outside public can get in, then you are protected in a way that only requires the basic authentication. Username and password is good enough in that situation. Okay, the next layer, and this is where it kind of gets interesting and exciting, is this notion of an API key. You've probably heard the terminology, but maybe don't fully understand what it means. So an API key is traditionally a very long string. It's traditionally very unique, hard to guess, and it's distributed under most APIs for security. It has a neat advantage, though, because an API key doesn't necessarily need to be tied to a particular user. And that's where you can break the mold of how do you get an entire workforce or an entire segment of this population entrance into my API without heckling each one for individual credentials. So an example of an API key would be Dropbox. Now, most of us have heard of Dropbox, the service. And if you wanted to talk to Dropbox right now today and create a solution to talk to Dropbox, your very first step would be to log into your account on the website, just like you normally would on Dropbox. And at that point, it's asking you for your username and password. It is. But that's the last time it'll ask you, because you'll go to a certain area on that website and say, give me an API key. And Dropbox will present to you a unique API key specific to your account. Then you take that API key, and from that moment forward, when you use that, you'll be using that to talk to Dropbox. What are the advantages of that? Well, number one, if you change your username and password, the API key doesn't care. It's still your API key. So that's a big advantage. The other advantage is if you're building, let's say, a website where you want people to be able to communicate directly to your Dropbox, you could create a portal on a website, let's say, and give them an area to upload a file specific to your Dropbox. Now, you don't want them to get your username and password. You don't want to heckle them with that. Rather, you just say, but I do want it to go to my Dropbox. So this is an example of where you use your API key. And that website would know, OK, this person is talking to that. It has pre-authorization to do it through the API key. Traditionally, API keys are not distributed. They're not given out. They're completely hidden behind the mechanism that's making the request, whether it be a website or FileMaker Pro Advanced. In fact, when you get an API key from Dropbox, it says right there, do not share this, do not distribute it. This is highly, highly secure. In other words, you don't want that out, because if someone had your API key, they'd have all the rights and privileges you do, the full rights and privileges of your Dropbox account. So that's how API keys work. Today, API keys are used heavily on Amazon Web Services. When you create a new user, you have the additional ability to create an API key and work that way with Amazon. So that is how a lot of APIs work today. In fact, QuickBooks Online, the older versions of QuickBooks Online, started using with API keys. They have now moved past that, and they're now into the next level of authentication, which we're about to talk about now. And that is OAuth, which stands for Open Authentication. And this is the modern way, the most secure, the most flexible, the modern way of doing security through APIs. So this was created as late as, OAuth was created in 2010. 2 years later, OAuth 2 came out, and that's 2012. So this is fairly new technology, and it's being widely adopted because it adheres to a set of standards. But what makes this even more important than, let's say, an API key, is that you can grant authority from an outside source. And that's what makes it really awesome, Because if you are building a system and you know these groups of users are over here, but you don't have any of their credentials, you don't know anyone's username and password, but you know that this group is going to be allowed to work with your API key or with your API, all you need to do is say authenticate over here from a third party, and it will pass that information to say this person is allowed to come in. So how many of you have gone to a website where you have been asked for a username and password, but you also have the added advantage of saying, well, put in your Google information or your Facebook information? Have you ever seen that where you can, yeah, that is essentially a form of OAuth. They're authenticating you over here to say this is a legitimate person with a legitimate account, and then passing that information through. Now the person that you're actually logging, the site you're logging into, doesn't have to keep track of your username and password because Facebook's got it or Google has it. So that's some of the things that OAuth can do that make it totally different than the other forms of security. So examples of this would be the latest version of QuickBooks Online. Uses OAuth 2. In fact, they changed that standard not so long ago, and we had to rebuild our plugin to accommodate for that. All the Google APIs now use OAuth 2, and all the Microsoft products, Office 365 and so forth, use OAuth 2. In fact, this is nothing new. Almost everybody is moving in this direction for authentication. And generally what it means is when you attempt your first attempt to that API, let's say I'm on a website, it'll prompt you for a username and password in whatever they're using to authenticate you. Once it's happy with that, it lets you through. Okay, so if we take this same example where we had the person ordering the food and then the person ordering the adult beverage, I've asked for your ID, and that's allowed you to buy drinks. But what happens if you are at a festival and you're wanting to do this all day long? You might receive something like a wristband, in this case, a token. And what the OAuth and some of these levels of security allow you to do is it presents a token, not an API key, but a token. And a token is a form of a temporary privilege, if you will. And the advantage of a token is that it can be short-lived. You can issue a token that only lasts 15 minutes, or you can issue a token that lasts a complete day, or 2 weeks. And in the case of QuickBooks Online, for example, when a token is issued, I believe it lasts for 6 months. After 6 months, you have two choices. You can refresh the token, provided you give them the original token, but they have accommodations to refresh the token, and can do that sort of programmatically without prompting any user, or it will expire, and then you can request a new token. In the case of working with the FileMaker Server API, your token is 15 minutes long. That's it. If you make your request, you've got 15 minutes to do something with it. Or if you're idle for 15 minutes, that token will expire, and you'll have to get a brand new token to begin and continue to talk to that API. So that's how that works. So if we take a look at the FileMaker Server admin API, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive here and see what it might be like to talk to the Server admin API from a step-by-step process. And some of this might come in and really let you see it firsthand. Now, the first thing you would do if you wanted to talk to FileMaker Server is you would have to locate the documentation. And without the documentation, you really have no hope. You can be the world's greatest API integrator, but without the documentation, you will get nowhere, because the documentation is really your key to how this particular API works. And it's going to present to you different things like endpoints and the URL and the nomenclature on how you're going to talk to it. So it's the language of this particular API. And although APIs are similar, and after you go through this lesson, a lot of them work the same way, but none of them are the same. So you could learn one API only to be frustrated with starting from scratch on another API. The good news is that once you learn the API once, it actually translates, so it's a lot easier to do the second and third and fourth, but you still have to refer to the documentation. So what you'll hear from a typical developer when they say, oh, I'm working with this API, and the documentation is lousy, it's because they're frustrated with the documentation not written in a way that makes it easy to work with. Or worse still, some of these things don't work. You'll try something and it simply won't work because the API is, after all, created by humans, and like any other piece of software, it has its flaws as well. So a lot of the journey that you're on here is predicated on how good the API is or isn't that you're working with. So give yourself a chance to really understand that it may not be you in some cases. It may be just the system that you're working with. So when you're embarking on a journey to work with an API, your very first question is, how good are the docs? How solid is the API? What kind of support is there? How well will I understand it? And you'll find that some pieces of software, especially proprietary ones, have very limited documentation and very, non-developed standards on how to do it. So that brings us to these words called methods. And you've probably heard these in and around as you explore this topic from the outside. You have the get, and that method really its purpose is to retrieve information. Think of it as the reading of information. You get information and you pull it back. The next one is a post. This is where you're going to submit data to be processed. And that's in the form of a post. Then you have the put and the patch, which is where you'll be updating a particular, this is your edit in a sense, you'll be updating a particular record or series of records, and at that point you're going to need an ID. And then finally you have the delete. When it's time to delete, you'll delete it, also will need a specific ID. Okay, then there's this notion of endpoints. You might have heard of that terminology. But the endpoint is essentially the end tail of that URL when you make that call. That's what tells the API specifically what area that you're working with. So in the case of FileMaker Server Admin API, specific to the Admin API, the first part of my URL, which you see here is the HTTPS, then you'll have all the server information that will tell you what server I'm talking to. Then you'll have the version of the API and some other fundamentals. Then finally, this part over here where it says server and status, that's very specific to this command. You're saying that I want to get the server status of that admin API. And because I'm using the get command, it's essentially saying, give me the server status, pull it down, and that's it. Now, what's interesting about that is I can put in the exact same URL, but because I'm using patch, I'll get a different result from that. In fact, at this point, I am pushing information to the status of the FileMaker Admin API. So the first one is to get the status of what things are. In this case, like whether the server is on or off, that's the get. And then the patch would be to, you could send a command to turn the server off using that patch. But it's the same endpoint. So it's important to know that endpoints aren't necessarily unique by the command, that the actual method can change and dictate that. Taken a step further, if we look at how post works, this is, now you'll see that the URL is the same at the first part, HTTPS, my server info, and now I'm using the endpoint clients / a particular client ID and a particular message. In this case, the post would be actually sending a user a message like, we're closing the database in 10 minutes. And that's what that command would do. It would be in the form of a post. It would have a URL that looks like that. You would have to supply a client ID, which presumably you would get on a previous command where you poll the clients and pull all their IDs. Then you determine the ID with the person, and then you send them a message. All these things work together. And then finally, delete. Now, in this case, the word delete is sort of loosely known as to delete a record or to delete a status. In this case, delete means log that user off. That's what that means in that case. And again, this is very specific to the admin API only. If you were to work with the data API, you would have a different URL, you'd have a different set of endpoints, you'd have different requirements. And again, you get all this information. All of this information is available through the documentation you get with the respective API. Okay. So let's take a look at how the workflow works when we talk about APIs. First, you'd make a post, and you would request the token. And again, this is very specific to how FileMaker Data API works and FileMaker Server Admin API works. You provide the username and password. It's a one-time call. You provide that password, you receive a token from the API. Once you receive that token, you store it. You could store it in a variable. You could store it in a global field. You probably wouldn't want to store it permanently because we all know that it only lasts 15 minutes if you've been idle, but you would want to store it because every subsequent call, you'll be using the token from that point forward. Then you can do a get and do your first get request, and that will use the token in that case, and then you'll receive the settings back. So that's how all this works, back and forth, back and forth. Once you get the token, you store it for that whole session. Now you have the ability to delete the token. Let's say you created a token, but you wanted to delete it and use a new one. You can do that. If the token goes stale and it's idle and it doesn't work, you'll make the request and it won't work. You'll try to use that old token and it'll tell you token expired, essentially. At that point, you'd have to put in the username and password again and request a new token. So token management is a very big part of working with APIs. Managing all this construct is really the responsibility of the developer, and troubleshooting it and error trapping it all. That's where a lot of these problems come up, and that's where it can get a little difficult. But if you have FileMaker skills and script maker skills and all of that, this becomes second nature once you get used to it. All right, so now let's take a look at this slide. If you were to memorize any one slide, this would be it. There's really three essential components when you make an API call from FileMaker to the world. We have the URL and the endpoint, and really those are combined as one string. That's part one. Part two is the header, and part three is the body. And really that's it. Just about every API call that you can think of uses this combination of things to get started. That's what they all have in common. And if you take a look at an example of a patch here, that's the official URL if you were to talk to our pculearning.com server. Notice the /FMI, the /admin, and the /API version 2. That whole URL, all that's doing is orienting your computer to go to the right server. It's a FileMaker-related API. That's where the FMI comes from. Admin says, oh, we're talking to the admin API versus the data API. That's a different, it's a different URL. And it's version 2. So when FileMaker, let's say FileMaker 1920 comes out, or Claris, or whatever it's called later on, it will be V2, V3, V4. There's even the option to use vLatest. If you're using the data API, you actually put in vLatest with a capital L, by the way, and that will get you the latest API based on the server that you're talking to. So that's the URL. Pretty straightforward. That's not hard to understand right there. But if you've never done this before and you don't have any documentation, then it's a mystery until you get into that. Now, appended to that, right after the V2, you'll be putting in this string, which is very unique to the call. Again, we talked about it a little bit. This is the endpoint. And in this case, we're saying, yes, I want to talk about the server part of the API, so the server settings, or in this case, server/config/general. And if I made that call, it would update the server settings, which you're going to see here in a minute. So that's the URL and the endpoint. Now let's talk about the header. The header it's a formality. It's something you have to do in order to get all this to work. In this case, we're using authentication:bearer, and we're putting in that token. So it's those keywords, -- header, authentication bearer, token, end quote. That whole thing with a -- header, that's essentially going to be the first part of your curl statement, which we'll learn about that in a minute here in a few more slides. But that's I'd say it's a formality. You have to give it the header so that you're telling the API, here's my token. So that's the first piece of unique data other than the URL that you're giving it. You're actually sending that data to the API. The next thing you need to send, and these don't have to be in any particular order as long as they're both there in the header, is the content type application JSON. And all that's doing is telling you the language we're speaking. We're speaking JSON. And that's how all the APIs work for FileMaker, is the JSON language. So those are the two formalities. You put those in there, you're covered, at least on this command here, for the patching of the general settings. Okay, so that gets us oriented. Now there's only one piece of the equation left if we were updating server settings using this command, and that piece is the body. And the body, also known as the payload, you've heard that word before, payload, that's the JSON formatted text. Those are the goodies. That's what it's going to get when we send this thing. Now, if you interpret that, if you've worked with FileMaker Server before, you can kind of read through this. What we're saying here is that we want the maximum files of FileMaker to be 125. Allow yourself to host 125 files, which, by the way, is the default. Make your maximum PSOS, which is perform script on server, up to 100 connections simultaneously. That's what the 100 stands for. Cache size, 2048. And then auto start the database engine, set to true, and the auto start web publishing engine also set to true, so that when the server starts, those services will start automatically. So that payload is within one command, within milliseconds here, we're telling server to behave under these properties. And you'll see that some commands are readily available for the server that aren't necessarily available in the actual admin console. Now, I can't explain all the reasons why that was done a certain way. I'm sure there's engineering reasons and other reasons, but essentially this is one way to talk directly to the FileMaker server, and that's formatted as JSON, which we're going to talk about very shortly here. All right, now here's where the rubber meets the road. Here's where it might all come together for you. This that you're looking at here is nothing that you haven't seen before. This is an excerpt from the script steps, and the first one that I've highlighted here is called insert from URL, and that's where the magic happens. That one command is your gateway to the world of APIs. That one command, insert from URL, that's where it all happens, or most of it, I should say. And that command, in its very nature, really only has 3 boxes to choose from. The first box is simple. We already know what that is. That's the target, which means, are we storing the results in a variable, or are we storing the results in a field? And that's the only choices you get under that box. That's the one we all understand. That's no different than set field and no different than set variable. That box has been there for years, and that's the easy part to understand. The second box is almost as easy. That's where that entire URL goes, appended by the endpoint. And that's all that goes in that box. It really very simple, very straightforward, very easy. Now the third box, not so easy. Unfortunately, that box is completely blank. It's a calculation dialog box. And that's what makes this harder. That's what makes this exciting, but challenging. And the reason for that is because it's the Wild West. It's where you can do anything that you want to do, or anything that'll let you do. This is where your curl statement goes. And where that becomes difficult is because that's another language that maybe we didn't all grow up with, or maybe some of us did, but that's where all the unknowns are. That's where the experiment is. That's where you pull your hair out or get excited. That's what makes this more difficult than, let's say, a traditional script step. And there's not a lot of information out here about how this all works. And curl, and that very nature of curl, which, by the way, stands for Client Uniform Resource Locator, fancy words for client URL. That's all curl is client URL. Think of it as a set of commands, command lines, that you can send with your payload to say, here's the text, and by the way, do this, 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 and this. And that's all you're sending. You're sending the text, this is what I want you to perform, here's the information you need, and then the curl will say, do this, do that, I'm talking this type of language, here's what you go, do this and that. This is where you send it to perform a script. This is where you have it do FTP uploads. All those things, all that magic happens within that curl statement. And if there's time, I'll show you where you can get the list of all the approved FileMaker curl commands, because it's not necessarily obvious or easy to find that unless you know what to look for. So I'll show you that if there's time. I'll go another 10 or so minutes, and then we'll do questions at the end at 11:50. And I have a mic there we can go up to later. Okay, now, JSON. How many people have ever worked with JSON and the commands therein within FileMaker, know much about it? Okay. All right, well, quite a bit, actually. All right. Well, if you're FileMaker certified, you can't escape. You have to learn at least the basic of JSON, right? But let's talk about some things that maybe we don't talk about too much. First of all, what does it stand for? It stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, that's what it stands for. And it's lightweight, and it's a lightweight data interchange format. And what's really special about JSON is that it's self-describing. You can look at a JSON piece of text and understand in general terms what it's doing or what it's representing. It's also language independent. JSON is used everywhere. In the world of APIs, it's used everywhere. It is the dominant, it's the gorilla in the room. It really is the way that all of this stuff works. That's how we communicate the text back and forth. Now let me just show you a quick excerpt. This is actually from the FileMaker help. This is a small portion of their JSON example. And if you think back, if you've been working with FileMaker for a long time or databases, and you think about how we used to exchange data and how we still exchange data today, we would most likely export into a CSV file. And a CSV file has been around forever, and it's easy to understand. It's got the field names on the top, let's say, or if it's a .merge file, it's got the field names on the top, and it's got the data coming down. And it's been working great. But what are some of the disadvantages of a CSV file? Have you ever tried to export a list of invoices with their line items? The CSV file goes crazy. All of a sudden, you've got the invoice with the line item, the line item, the line item, and all these fields are blank. And it's just not a great format for anything other than flat file data. And it is great for flat file data, but if you are going to represent an invoice with the line items, chances are you'll have to export them separately. Here's my invoices, here's my line items, here's my customers, import it all back, match it by ID. But if you look at the JSON example, you'll see immediately how it exposes itself and demonstrates to you readily that, wow, I've got a bakery. I've got bakery on the top, then under bakery I have product. Then under that, I actually have field names, ID, name, price, stock, category. Those are my field names, followed by the data. And over, as you read through these JSON docs, the field name is always next to the data. So you never have to wonder what that data represents, because the field name is right next to it. You never have to wonder what it's a subcategory of, because if you just look above, you'll see, oh, that's in the product item or the product object. So those are the distinct advantages of JSON, and that's why it's been adopted so heavily and why it's used everywhere. So if you are going to work with APIs, you really do have to master JSON. And what I would recommend, if you don't already have it mastered, is simply try to construct JSON using FileMaker, construct a JSON statement, see that it works, and use the JSON commands. There's 6 or so built into FileMaker. And you can set commands, and then you can get the JSON. So I'd recommend create the JSON, and then parse the JSON. Create the JSON, parse the JSON. Get used to how to construct it. Our university goes through all of this JSON, and it really makes it easy for you to understand. But that's what I would encourage you to do for homework if you don't already know how to do that. Then we have this notion of REST. We hear this is REST here, RESTful this, RESTful that. It really isn't a big deal. All REST is an architectural style. It's essentially a set of standards. It was developed by one person in 2000. This person did their PhD dissertation. He presented this idea, this notion of what makes a good API, and he set these standards, and it became the REST standard, and it stands for Representational State Transfer. It's the idea of how can we make these APIs easier? How can we set standards? So when you hear that it's a RESTful API and FileMaker says this is a RESTful API, all they're saying is that it follows these guidelines, these standards, and it will be good to work with. All right. So the idea of APIs, they work across HTTP, which is a universal language that's been around forever. and the primary the media types are JSON, which we talked about, and XML. But XML is going away. JSON is definitely the dominant force there when it comes to APIs. Okay, so we already talked about the insert from URL as the primary way that you would use FileMaker Client as an API consumer. But you also have to consider that just because you have the insert from URL, you do have to create a whole script infrastructure around that. Again, the token management, the account management, what the commands are, the endpoints, and all of this you can store in different fields and create layouts, records for all your preferences. Your endpoints could be all stored in FileMaker. You could create a whole environment to make it easier for you to talk to an API if you're using FileMaker. So scripts and schema are a big part of that. Understanding and mastering the JSON functions will definitely help, and that's also part of the equation. I did mention earlier that the web viewer, that is a form of an API mechanism. It's sort of version 1, if you will, and it does just the basics, but it is a form of an API gateway. What we didn't talk about is plugins. Now, the advantage of a plugin is that all of that security, the construct, all the way that you communicate is handled for you in a plugin combined in this package that you can install in FileMaker. And then all you're dealing with at that point, there's no JSON, it's all script steps. Set field, set field, set field. The plugin is doing all the JSON management, all that management. So when people say, do I need a plugin to talk with Google? The answer is no. You don't need a plugin to talk to Google. You can do it natively with the insert from URL. The next question is, how good are you with API integration? How well do you know the Google interface? You might say, well, I'm just learning. Say, well, maybe it's time to consider a plugin to help you through that process, because a plugin is only going to require you to learn script steps and have a basic understanding. In addition, the Google APIs are particularly difficult. Each one works a little differently. The context is different than the calendar is different than the tasks, and they all sort of this conglomerate of things. So when we created the Google plugin, for example, the G manipulator, we spent weeks really just honing all that information, getting it into the form of a plugin to make it easy for people who don't want to go it on their own. But certainly, do you need a plugin? No. Would you want one? There are occasions where it really would come in handy, depending on your needs. The other thing to consider, and what we use here at Productive all the time, is an SDK. You might have heard that word thrown around. It stands for Software Developer Kit. This is really designed for people who have strong programming background, but their advantages are they're pre-built and ready to work with the API. So what oftentimes happens, Google included, Google will say, here's our API. It's the Wild West of all these commands. However, we'll make it easier for you, Mr. and Mrs. Developer. We will give you a software development kit, an SDK. You say, what can I do with the SDK? The SDK is pre-written in a language. It could be Ruby on Rails, it could be Python. Those languages are pre-written so that this SDK automatically talks to the API. In fact, so when we make a plugin, we traditionally use the SDK to help us talk to the API because so much of it is already built out. And it's in a way that adheres to their restrictions and their standards. And of course, SDKs are traditionally made in popular languages. So now you know a little bit about SDKs and how they differ from APIs. They're really just nothing more than a tool that lets you work easier with a particular software provider. Okay. Well, I am going to go a little further on these slides because this gets exciting. This is the new stuff that you'll probably be learning about tomorrow. Now, I don't have any demos. I really don't know much about it. All I've been given permission to do at this point is to present to you 3 or 4 or 5 slides about what you can expect. In fact, the name in the middle, at this point, I'm not even sure if that's the final name, but this is essentially the new stuff, and it comes perfect timing for our presentation here. What you see here is the new product in the middle, and what you learned earlier this morning is that this product is already pre-built to work with several different APIs, some of which are included there as icons that you might recognize, including QuickBooks. We've got MailChimp and FileMaker Server itself, Box, things like that. So what is this? How does it help us? What direction does this bring us to? So here are some key features with this new software offering, I guess you could call it. You have the ability to connect to any app. So it's pre-wired for you to actually create connection points without programming, without traditional programming, I should say. There's still a form of programming or setup, but not really anything like what we've talked about so far. Workflows, there's actually built-in databases, so you have places to store your data within this mechanism outside of FileMaker. Artificial intelligence is built in, mobile, web forms, serverless Node.js, which means you can provide a set of commands. It will go do those commands and bring back results. And it's scalable. And that's exciting too, because you don't have to pre-configure what you might need in terms of scale, number of transactions, things like that. It's all flexible in that way. So that's another interesting thing. So this notion here, how this works, is the idea of a trigger and an action. The trigger is, under these conditions, let's say if the date is a certain date, or if a record is received over in here, or any condition that might trigger an action, that's how that starts. The trigger, then it folds into an action. What would you like to do once that trigger has happened? And I'll show you some examples here in a second. So think trigger and action. So let's say you have a customer that has completed your DocuSign request. You sent a proposal and the DocuSign was signed. They've done that. Now DocuSign, in a sense, sends a trigger that a new document has been signed, and that trigger then creates an action which goes to, let's say, the pipe drive. In this case, this is a CRM. It goes to the pipe drive for that record and says, the document has been signed. You have been approved. So that triggers the pipeline record to be marked as closed, and then sends a notification to Slack to let the stakeholders know that the new contact has been added and the document has been signed. Just like that. So that's a simple form. We've got really three entities. We have DocuSign, Pipeline, and Slack talking together in a series based on triggers and actions. And again, all of that is set up ahead of time in a presumably simple to use workflow method, I should say, a list of items that you can do. And that would be an example of three programs talking to each other under that condition. Let's take a look at another example. We've got DocuSign, signed a contract. Same goes to Pipedrive. This case, we want it to be marked as closed, but we want an invoice created in QuickBooks. But we also want QuickBooks, after the invoice has been created, to put the invoice number back in Pipeline, or Pipedrive, I should say, and then notify the user. So that's just another example, basically an extension there of what you saw on the previous slide. All of this is going to be configured in a screen that probably won't look like this in its final version, but this gives you an idea of what you might expect. You have the MailChimp, and the action might be when a new subscriber hits your MailChimp information, you would set up a flow variable where I guess at this point you would say the last name. If the last name is empty, do this and that, update the list, send an email, and create a record in FileMaker. So that's kind of a very, very early example of what a flow might look like for this type of integration. Then there's this notion of connectors. So each one of these is called a connector, and you basically make triggers and actions on these connectors. Again, a lot of this will be, I'm sure, explained to you as time goes on here at DevCon. So a quick recap. APIs allow two programs to communicate. There's consumers, there's providers. No two APIs are alike. You've got to use the documentation between the two. The second integration is easier than the first. And Starling, which you saw just a moment ago, to bridge the gap, to allow non-developers to create workflows and talk to multiple apps simultaneously using triggers and actions. Understanding APIs, whether you use this new technology or not, understanding the APIs is a really important skill set. It really does round out your development environment. I think gone are the days where we can hide from some of these ancillary technologies. I think that the API in particular, API technologies and understanding that is it's going to be an accepted foundation for any FileMaker developer. I don't think that your skills alone as a FileMaker developer, your perspective into APIs and your ability to work with them would be most beneficial, for sure. Okay.
I think they're calling it Claris Connect.
Okay, good, thank you.
It was in the announcement on the site.
Okay, thank you. So Claris Connect is the official name of what you just saw. I was using the code name prior to launch. So how do you get started? I think you want to seek training. We do have Productive Computing University training courses for everything you saw here, the APIs, and we're going to be exploring that. There's online training, there's community blogs, learn JSON, and then decide what client you want to use to start your API work. And Postman, which I didn't talk about much, but that's another client that you can use that has pre-built in templates for APIs. And there's actually a whole session on Postman here at DevCon, so look that up and you can learn about how that can help you through this process. Is that it? Okay, so I do have 4 minutes for questions. If you want to pose a question, you could just go up to the mic there and I'll do my best to answer it. There should be a mic right in the middle, ready to go.
Do you have those resources that you said it's hard to find?
Oh yes, let me do that. All you do for the curl is you go to the internet and you put in FileMaker 18 curl, CURL. And there you will find a document for this called Supported Curl Options, and you'll see FileMaker 18 Advanced. And then right here, I'll blow this up a little bit for you. This is your full list of all the curl commands that you would use for your API work. This is all the FileMaker supported curl commands. And you can see it's quite extensive. Okay. Are there any questions? Okay, we have 2 here. Great, thanks. Or 2 so far.
Hey there. I just have a what I'm hoping is a quick common troubleshooting question. I have a new client just starting to work with an API with them using JSON, and I'm having trouble connecting to their network all the way from my office. I've already checked all the ports, and there's not supposed to be any firewall in place that would prevent me. Do you know any other common stumbling blocks that would prevent me from accessing the server of another network?
I would just say, first things I would look for is the domain that you're working with. Does the domain point to the right server? Definitely the ports are a big issue. You can do some basic things like pinging.
Yeah, we tried the domain and the ping and the ports. We tested all those.
Maybe you could talk to me off the line, and I'll give you some more ideas. Yeah.
Thanks.
But that's what I'd start with. Thanks. Another question here.
Hey, I'm just curious, do you ever see, how likely is it that an API structure might change? Hopefully not. I mean, that obviously causes problems, but things get deprecated. I mean, how does that communicated?
All the time.
Yeah.
All the time.
Right, it wasn't the answer I was looking for.
No, right, no, APIs change all the time. A great example is the FileMaker Data API. Introduced in 16, officially made available in 17, and continues to change potentially every year. I mean, maybe not in drastic ways, but yeah, APIs change all the time. The QuickBooks API changes all the time. So we're always running and jumping. Now, to be fair, most APIs in a well-adopted environment don't change to the point where everything's going to break overnight.
Sure.
And a lot of times they try to warn the developers. So they do change all the time, but maybe not to the extent where you're going to be left hanging all the time.
Good.
Yeah, thanks. Well, if there's no further questions, I really thank you for watching, and fill out your, thank you very much.